Welcome to Alien Whisper, where sizzling hot alien women and emotional sci-fi alien stories await you. If you enjoy thrilling adventures between humans and extraterrestrial beings, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below the video. Now, let's dive into the story. The air was thick with the tang of metal and recycled oxygen, a faint hum pulsing through the walls of Nexus Point like a living heartbeat. Zara stirred on a narrow cot, her body heavy with pain, as if every bone had been bruised by the galaxy itself. Her eyes fluttered open, meeting the dim glow of a flickering overhead light. The room was small, cluttered with crates and medical supplies, the kind of makeshift infirmary you'd find on a space station teetering between order and chaos. Her side throbbed, a jagged scar beneath a fresh bandage reminding her of the fight that had nearly ended her. Zara's breath caught as fragments of memory surfaced. Flashing lights, the screech of alarms, and the cold grip of PsyCorp's lab. She'd been a prisoner, one of countless psychics they'd hunted for their experiments. Her Zorathian heritage made her a prime target. Her ability to read minds and manipulate thoughts was both a gift and a curse. PsyCorp wanted to harness it, to turn her into a weapon. But she'd escaped, barely, leaving a trail of blood and chaos. How she'd ended up here, on Nexus Point, was a blur. The station's hum grew louder, a constant drone that mingled with the distant clatter of cargo drones and the murmur of voices beyond the door. Nexus Point was a sprawling hub, a melting pot of species from across the galaxy. Humans, Vexians, Zorathians, and countless others. Its markets bustled with traders selling glowing crystals and robotic limbs, while its underbelly hid smugglers and fugitives like her. Zara had heard of it as a place where you could disappear, but also where trouble found you fast. She tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through her ribs. Her psychic senses, usually sharp, felt dulled, like a radio struggling to find a signal. She reached out, probing the room, and sensed a single mind nearby, calm, guarded, but tinged with urgency. Before she could dig deeper, the door slid open with a soft hiss, and a man stepped in. He was human, broad-shouldered, with a face hardened by years of conflict. His dark hair was cropped short, and a faint scar ran across his jaw, barely visible in the dim light. His eyes, sharp and gray, locked onto hers, assessing her in a way that felt both protective and wary. He wore a worn leather jacket, a blaster holstered at his hip, and carried the air of someone who'd seen too much but kept going. "You're awake," he said, his voice low, with a slight drawl that marked him as someone from Earth's outer colonies. "Good. We don't have much time." Zara's throat was dry, but she forced the words out. "Who are you? Where am I?" "Name's Jax," he said, pulling a chair closer and sitting, his movements deliberate. "You're on Nexus Point, in a safe house. I found you half dead in a cargo bay, bleeding out from a PsyCorp stun blast. Took some work to patch you up." Her heart raced, memories of her escape flooding back. She'd been running through PsyCorp's lab, alarms blaring, guards shouting. She'd used her psychic powers to confuse them, planting false images in their minds, a trick that had saved her but drained her. The last thing she remembered was collapsing in a dark alley, ships roaring overhead. The lab had been a nightmare of cold steel and harsh lights. Zara, strapped to a table, felt needles pierce her skin as PsyCorp scientists whispered about the Concord Project. She'd caught glimpses of their thoughts, a device to control psychics, to strip away free will. The idea chilled her, fueling her desperation. When a power surge disrupted the lab systems, she'd seized her chance, breaking free with a psychic burst that knocked out her captors. She'd fled, dodging blaster fire, her vision blurring as blood seeped from a wound at her side. Nexus Point's docks were her only hope, a place to vanish among the crowds. Back in the present, Zara shook off the memory, focusing on Jax. "Why'd you save me?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "What do you want?" Jax leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Let's just say I've got my own beef with PsyCorp. They've been hunting psychics like you for years, and I've seen what they do. I don't like it." She narrowed her eyes, trying to read him, but his mind was a fortress, shielded in a way that suggested training. That's not an answer. What's in it for you? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fair enough. I used to work for them, mercenary gigs, nothing proud. Saw too much, did things I regret. Now, I'm trying to make it right. You're a chance to do that. Zara's stomach twisted. A former PsyCorp operative? Trusting him was a risk, but she had no allies, no plan. Her people, the Zorathians, were scattered, their colonies ravaged by PsyCorp's raids. She was alone, and Nexus Point was a temporary refuge at best. What do you know about PsyCorp? She asked, testing him. Jax's eyes darkened. They're not just a corporation. They're a shadow empire, pulling strings across the galaxy. Their labs aren't just for research. They're building something big. I've heard whispers about a project that could control minds, not just psychics, but anyone. If it's true, no one's safe. Zara's breath hitched. The Concord Project. Even in her foggy state, the name sent a chill through her. She'd seen enough in the lab to know it wasn't a rumor. You're talking about the Concord Project, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jax's gaze sharpened. You know about it? Enough to know it's real, she said. I saw their plans, their tests. They're close to finishing it. He leaned forward, urgency breaking through his calm. Then you're more important than I thought. PsyCorp will come for you, Zara. They can't let you walk free with what you know. The room seemed to shrink, the hum of the station louder in her ears. She was a target, exposed on a station crawling with bounty hunters and PsyCorp spies. But Jax's words stirred something in her, a spark of defiance. She'd escaped once. She could fight again. What's your plan? She asked, her voice steadier now. Jax stood, checking his blaster. We get you off this station, find somewhere safe. Then we figure out how to hit PsyCorp where it hurts. But first, you need a rest. You're no good to anyone half dead. Zara wanted to argue, but exhaustion tugged at her. She lay back, the cot creaking under her weight. I don't trust you, she said, eyes locked on his. He gave a small, crooked smile. Smart, but I'm all you've got right now. As he stepped toward the door, a distant explosion rocked the station, the lights flickering wildly. Jax froze, hand on his blaster. That's not good, he muttered. Zara sat up, pain forgotten, her psychic senses flaring. She felt them, hostile minds closing in. PsyCorp had found her. Time's up, Jax said, his voice grim. We move. Now. She swung her legs off the cot, heart pounding. Nexus Point was no longer a refuge. It was a battlefield. Whatever came next, Zara knew one thing. She wasn't going down without a fight. The safe house trembled as another distant explosion rocked Nexus Point, the flickering lights casting jagged shadows across the cramped infirmary. Zara stood, ignoring the sharp pain in her side, her psychic senses flaring with the presence of hostile minds closing in. The air was thick with the scent of burnt wiring, and the station's hum buzzed like an angry swarm. Jax, blaster drawn, peered through the door's narrow window, his face grim. They're here, he said, voice low but urgent. PsyCorp agents. We need to move. Zara's heart pounded, her mind racing. She'd barely processed Jax's claim of being a former PsyCorp mercenary, and now they were hunted. Trusting him was a gamble, but staying put meant capture, or worse. Where to? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Lower levels, Jax said, slinging a bag over his shoulder. The docks. We can blend in with the crowds, maybe find a ship. But first, you need answers. Ask fast. Zara grabbed a jacket from a nearby crate, wincing as she pulled it on. Who are you, really? And why risk your neck for me? Jax hesitated, his gray eyes meeting hers, guarded but honest. I told you, I'm Jax. Grew up on Earth's outer colonies. Ran with smugglers before PsyCorp hired me. I was muscle, tracking targets, psychics mostly. They paid well, and I didn't ask questions. Not at first. The safe house shook again, dust falling from the ceiling. Zara steadied herself against the cot, her psychic senses picking up the agent's cold determination. 5 minds, maybe 6, sweeping the sector. What changed? She pressed, needing to know before she followed him into the chaos. Jax's jaw tightened, a shadow crossing his face. I saw what they did to people like you. Labs, experiments, things that'd make your skin crawl. They weren't just studying psychics. They were breaking them, turning them into tools. I had a partner once, a psychic named Mara. She was like you, strong, stubborn. PsyCorp got her, and I couldn't save her. That's when I walked away. Zara's breath caught, sensing the raw pain in his words. Her own memories of PsyCorp's lab, sterile tables, needles, the hum of machines, surged back. I'm sorry, she said, softer now. But how do I know you're not still with them? He pulled a data pad from his bag, its screen cracked but glowing. Because I've been stealing their secrets, he said, tossing it to her. Look, Zara caught the pad, her fingers brushing its cool surface. She activated it, and a flood of files appeared, schematics, reports, videos. Her stomach churned as she scrolled through footage of psychics, their eyes blank, moving like puppets in PsyCorp's labs. One file was labeled The Concord Project, detailing a device to control psychic minds, stripping away free will. It was worse than she'd feared. This is real, she whispered, her voice tight. They're almost done with it. Jax nodded, his expression grim. That's why they want you dead. You know too much, and your powers make you a threat. The Concord Project could enslave every psychic in the galaxy, maybe more. The door rattled, and a muffled shout echoed outside. Zara's psychic senses snapped to attention. 3 agents were at the door, 2 more circling the building. They're here, she said, shoving the pad into her jacket. Jax kicked a crate aside, revealing a hidden hatch in the floor. This leads to the service tunnels. Move. They dropped into the narrow tunnel, the air damp and heavy with the smell of rust. The walls were lined with pipes, hissing softly, and dim lights flickered overhead. Zara's boots splashed in shallow puddles as they ran, the station's hum a constant drone. Her side ached, but fear kept her moving. As they emerged into a lower-level corridor, the chaos of Nexus Point's underbelly hit them. The air was thick with smoke and the tang of fuel, stalls crammed with glowing tech and exotic goods. Traders shouted in a dozen languages, while drones were... The stairwell was a claustrophobic spiral, its metal steps slick with grime. Zara's psychic senses flared as they descended, picking up the agent's thoughts. Methodical, relentless, closing in. They're 2 levels above us, she warned, her voice low. They've got psychic dampeners. Jax cursed. Makes sense. They know you're here. At the next landing, Lena hacked a security panel, opening a side door into a bustling dockyard. Ships of every size loomed overhead, their engines roaring as they prepped for departure. The air was thick with fuel and ozone, the ground vibrating with the clank of machinery. Workers shouted, drones zipped by, and the chaos offered cover, but not for long. There, Lena pointed to a small freighter at the far end. That's our ride, if we can get to it. Before they could move, blaster fire erupted behind them. Zara spun, seeing 3 PsyCorp agents in black armor, their visors glinting. Down, she shouted, diving behind a cargo crate. Jax returned fire, his blaster's blue bolts lighting up the dock. Lena crouched, typing furiously on her data pad. I'm jamming their comms, she yelled. It'll slow them. Zara reached out with her mind, trying to confuse the agents, but the dampeners dulled her powers, like static drowning out a signal. She gritted her teeth, focusing harder, and managed to plant a fleeting illusion. One agent hesitated, thinking he saw Zara fleeing the wrong way. Nice trick, Jax said, grabbing her arm. Run. They sprinted toward the freighter, weaving through crates and dodging workers. The agents pursued, their boots pounding the deck. Zara's lungs burned, her injuries screaming with every step. But the ship was close now, its ramp open. Lena reached it first, hacking the door controls. Inside now, they scrambled aboard, the ramp closing just as blaster bolts sparked against it. Jax slammed the cockpit controls, and the freighter's engines roared to life. Zara collapsed into a seat, her vision swimming. As the ship lifted off, Nexus Point shrinking below, Jax turned to her. You okay? She nodded, catching her breath. For now. But PsyCorp won't stop. Lena, still clutching her pad, looked at Zara with admiration. You're tougher than the stories say. Zara managed a faint smile. We're not safe yet. Where are we going? Jax's eyes met hers, resolute. Somewhere PsyCorp can't reach. Then we plan our next move, together. The freighter soared into the starry void, but Zara knew the fight was just beginning. The Concord Project loomed, and with it, a battle for the galaxy's soul. The freighter's engines hummed softly as it drifted in the shadow of Nexus Point's outer docks, hidden among a cluster of derelict ships. Inside, Zara sat in the cramped cockpit, her hands gripping the edge of a metal table, the cool surface grounding her racing thoughts. The escape from PsyCorp's agents had been too close, and the weight of the Concord Project, a device capable of enslaving psychics, pressed heavily on her. Across from her, Jax checked a holographic map of the station, his face lit by its faint blue glow. Lena, hunched over a data pad, typed furiously, her young face set with determination. We can't stay here long, Jax said, his voice low but steady. PsyCorp's got eyes everywhere. We need a plan, and we need allies. Zara nodded, her psychic senses still raw from the chase. You mentioned a resistance group. Can it help us stop the Concord Project? Jax met her gaze, his gray eyes resolute. They're our best shot. Small, but they've been hitting PsyCorp for years. They're on Nexus Point, hiding in the lower levels. I've worked with them before. Lena looked up, her eyes wide with excitement. You're talking about Kale's crew, right? They're legends. I've hacked their comms, well, just to listen, not to spy. They're the real deal. Zara raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Lena's enthusiasm was infectious, but her admiration made Zara uneasy. Let's hope they're as good as you think, she said. Lead the way. They disembarked quietly, slipping into the station's lower levels through a service hatch. The air was thick with the smell of oil and stale food, the corridors narrow and lined with rusted panels. Flickering lights cast eerie shadows, and the distant clatter of machinery echoed like a heartbeat. Nexus Point's underbelly was a maze of forgotten tunnels and black market dens, a place where the galaxy's outcasts thrived. Lena guided them to a nondescript door, its surface scarred with graffiti. She knocked in a precise pattern, 2 quick taps, a pause, 3 slow ones. The door slid open with a groan, revealing a dimly lit room that buzzed with quiet purpose. Crates of tech and weapons lined the walls, and a faint hum of generators filled the air. 5 figures waited inside, their eyes sharp and wary. A Zorathian elder stepped forward, his skin glowing faintly under the low light, wrinkles tracing a life of hardship. I'm Kale, he said, his voice deep and calm. Leader of this cell. Jax, you brought trouble to our door. Jax gave a wry smile. Trouble's my specialty, Kale. This is Zara Navari, the psychic PsyCorp's hunting. She's seen the Concord Project up close. Kale's eyes narrowed, studying Zara, a Zorathian psychic. You've got courage surviving their labs. Tell us what you know. Zara took a breath, the room's stuffy air heavy in her lungs. PsyCorp's building a device to control psychic minds, maybe more. It's called the Concord Project, and it's nearly operational. I escaped their lab, but they're hunting me to keep it secret. A wiry alien with 4 arms and glowing eyes, Vex, the tech expert, leaned forward, his voice sharp. Control minds? That's no small feat. I've cracked PsyCorp systems before. Their tech is cutting edge. If this device is real, it's a game changer. Ren, a broad-shouldered human with a scarred face, crossed his arms. It's real. I worked PsyCorp security for 10 years. Saw things I can't unsee. That's why I defected. His voice carried a weight of guilt, and Zara sensed his regret, raw and unhealed. Lena, standing near Zara, piped up, her voice eager. Zara's not just any psychic. She's the one who broke out of their max security lab. Kale stroked his chin, his glowing skin pulsing faintly. We'll need a diversion to pull guards away. A fake explosion in the outer sector could work. I've got contacts who can rig it. Zara listened, her psychic senses tingling with the group's resolve. I can scan for psychic defenses inside, she said, but the dampeners will make it hard. I'll need to be close to sense anything. Jax nodded, his gaze steady. So, we enter through the tunnel, cut the power, and hit the lab while the guard are distracted. Who's on the infiltration team? I'm in, Zara said firmly. My powers will help us navigate. Jax raised a hand. Me too. I know PsyCorp's tactics. Ren grunted. I'm going. I owe them a reckoning. Vex shook his head. I'll stay here, running tech support with Lena. Those systems are tricky. Lena's face fell, her enthusiasm dimming. I want to go with Zara, she said, her voice small but determined. I can help on-site. Kale placed a hand on her shoulder. Your skills are vital here, Lena. You'll keep us connected. Zara caught Lena's disappointed gaze and offered a small smile. You're already helping more than you know, she said, hoping to ease the sting. To test their readiness, Kale led them to a hidden training area behind the main room, a cavernous space filled with salvage tech and mock obstacles. We move tomorrow, he said. Let's see what you've got. Ren demonstrated his combat skills, disarming a training drone with precise strikes, his movements heavy with years of experience. Vex rigged a mock explosive, his 4 arms working in sync, proving his tech prowess. Zara practiced her psychic abilities, lifting crates with her mind, though the effort left her dizzy. Jax ran through a simulated infiltration, dodging laser traps with agility that surprised Zara, hinting at his mercenary past. Lena, tasked with hacking a training console, bypassed its security in under a minute, her fingers a blur. Told you I'm good, she said, grinning at Zara. Zara nodded, impressed but cautious. Lena's admiration was flattering, but it carried a weight. She didn't want to be a hero, just a survivor. As the session ended, Kale gathered them around the map. This mission is dangerous, he said, his voice grave. PsyCorp will kill to protect their secrets. Are you ready? Zara met his gaze, her resolve hardening. I've been running from them my whole life. It's time to fight back. Jax clapped her shoulder, his touch brief but reassuring. We're in this together. Lena watched Zara, her eyes shining with hope. You're going to change everything, she said softly. The room buzzed with purpose, the hum of Nexus Point echoing their determination. Zara felt the weight of their trust, but also a spark of hope. The plan was risky, but it was their only chance to stop PsyCorp. As they finalized details, the station's heartbeat seemed to pulse in time with their own, signaling the fight ahead. The maintenance tunnel was a suffocating maze of rusted pipes and flickering lights, the air heavy with the stench of oil and decay. Zara led the way, her boots scraping against the damp metal floor, each step echoing in the claustrophobic space. Her psychic senses strained against the oppressive hum of Nexus Point's core, probing for threats. Jax followed close behind, blaster in hand, his eyes scanning every shadow. Ren brought up the rear, his broad frame barely fitting in the narrow passage, his scarred face tense with focus. Almost at the access hatch, Ren whispered, his voice barely cutting through the drone of machinery. It'll take us in a PsyCorp's facility, East Wing. Stay sharp. Zara nodded, her head throbbing from the effort of sensing beyond the tunnel's walls. She caught faint traces of mines, guards, their thoughts dulled by routine, but also something darker, sharper like a blade in the fog. Patrol ahead, she murmured, pausing. 3 guards, bored but armed. Jax gripped his blaster tighter, set to stun. Can you handle them? I'll try, Zara said, closing her eyes. She projected a subtle psychic nudge, planting the idea that the patrol should check a distant corridor. The guards' thoughts shifted, and their footsteps faded as they moved away. They're gone, she said, swaying slightly from the strain. They reached the hatch, a heavy slab of metal coated in grime. Ren tapped a stolen access code into the panel, and the hatch hissed open, revealing a stark, white corridor that reeked of antiseptic. The facility's sterile air stung Zara's lungs, a sharp contrast to the tunnel's dampness. The hum of machinery was louder here, vibrating through the floor like a pulse. Central Labs, 2 levels up, Ren said, pointing to a service elevator. But there's a security checkpoint. My old codes might still work. They moved cautiously, hugging the walls, the corridor's bright lights exposing every movement. Zara's senses buzzed, picking up a technician's mind in a nearby room, his thoughts drifting to a mundane report. Tech inside, she whispered. I can put him to sleep. Do it, Jax said, his voice low but firm. Zara focused, her head pounding as she reached into the technician's mind, easing him into a deep slumber. A soft thud echoed as he slumped over his console. She steadied herself against the wall, her vision blurring. Done, she gasped. Nice work, Jax said, catching her arm. You okay? She nodded, though the effort had drained her. Let's keep moving. At the checkpoint, Ren entered his code, but the panel flashed red, a low alarm buzzing. Damn, he muttered. They've changed the system. Zara's heart sank, but before she could respond, a security drone whirred around the corner, its red eye glowing. Jax fired, his blaster bolt striking the drone's core, sending it crashing in a shower of sparks. That'll bring more, he said. We need another way. Ren kicked a nearby vent cover loose. Ventilation shaft. It's tight, but it leads to the lab level. They crawled through the narrow shaft, the metal cold and slick with condensation. Zara's claustrophobia clawed at her, the hum of the facility deafening in the confined space. Her psychic senses flickered, weakened by the facility's dampeners, but she caught a faint pulse of energy, something powerful, alive and wrong. We're close, she whispered, her voice trembling. The Concord Project, it's active. Ren froze, his eyes wide. That's impossible. My intel said it was weeks from completion. Zara's stomach twisted. Your intel was wrong. Or you lied. Jack shot Ren a hard look. Talk, Ren. Why aren't you telling us? Ren's face tightened. Inside, the central lab was a vast, sterile chamber, its walls lined with humming consoles and glowing monitors. At its heart stood the Concord Project, a towering device pulsing with blue light, its core a swirling vortex of energy. Zara's skin prickled, a wave of psychic pressure hitting her like a storm. It's controlling psychics, she gasped, clutching her head. 5 figures stood guard, psychics, their eyes blank, movements jerky like marionettes. Their thoughts were a void, enslaved by the device. Jax raised his blaster, but Zara grabbed his arm. Don't. They're victims. Ren paled, his voice shaking. I didn't know it was this far along. Before they could plan, one psychic turned, unleashing a psychic blast that sent Jax staggering, pain exploding in his skull. Zara, he shouted, dropping to one knee. Zara shielded his mind, her own head screaming, but the dampeners weakened her. She tried breaking the psychic's control, projecting images of freedom, but the device's grip was ironclad. I can't reach them, she said, despair creeping in. The door burst open, and Lena appeared, breathless, her data pad glowing. Vex sent me, she yelled. I can jam the device's signal. Zara's hope surged. How'd you get here? Snuck through a service duct, Lena said, dodging a psychic blast. Vex is holding the outer guards. Give me a second. Lena slid behind a console, her fingers flying over a pad. The psychics advanced, their attacks relentless, forcing Zara to shield Jax and Ren with dwindling strength. Sparks flew as a console shorted out, the lab's lights flickering. Now, Lena shouted, hitting a command. A burst of static erupted, and the psychics staggered, their eyes clearing briefly. Ren sprinted to the device's control panel, entering commands from his PsyCorp days. Shutting it down, he yelled as the device's glow dimmed, its hum faltering. A cold, distorted voice boomed through the lab, chilling Zara's blood. You think this ends here? The architect sees all. The lights plunged into darkness, a low rumble shaking the floor. When power returned, the psychics had collapsed, free but unconscious. The device was dead, its core dark. Zara's knees buckled, exhaustion overwhelming her. We did it, Jax panted, helping her up. Ren stared at the device, his face ashen. That voice, it's him. The architect. Zara's jaw tightened. We're not done. We need to get this data to the Galactic Council. Lena clutched her pad, her eyes wide but fierce. "I'm with you." They fled the lab, the facility's alarms blaring, the hum fading as they vanished into the tunnels. Zara's heart raced, the architect's voice echoing in her mind. The fight was far from over, but they'd struck a blow PsyCorp wouldn't forget. The maintenance tunnel's damp, metallic walls seemed to close in as Zara, Jax, Ren, and Lena sprinted from PsyCorp's facility, their breaths ragged in the stale air. The distant hum of Nexus Point's engines vibrated through the floor, a stark contrast to the sterile silence of the lab they'd just escaped. Zara's side ached from her old injury, but adrenaline kept her moving. In her hand, she clutched a data pad loaded with evidence, videos, schematics, and testimonies exposing the Concord Project, PsyCorp's mind control device. Lena, waiting at the tunnel's exit, looked pale under the flickering lights, her young face etched with worry. "Did you do it?" she asked, her voice trembling but hopeful. Zara nodded, catching her breath. "The device is down, but PsyCorp's leader, someone called the Architect, is still out there. We can't stop yet." Jax, his blaster still in hand, clenched his jaw. "We need to take this to the Galactic Council. They're meeting today on Nexus Point. If we show them what PsyCorp's done, they'll have to act." Ren, wiping sweat from his scarred face, agreed. "I know the Council's security setup. Getting in won't be easy, but I can guide us through the service routes." Zara turned to Lena, her psychic senses picking up the girl's nervous excitement. "Lena, can you hack us into the Council chamber? We'll need access without raising alarms." Lena's eyes lit up, a grin spreading across her face. "I've got this. There's a maintenance network I can tap into. Follow me." They moved quickly through Nexus Point's crowded corridors, the station alive with the chatter of traders, the clatter of cargo drones, and the tang of exotic spices in the air. Lena led them away from the bustling main paths, where PsyCorp agents might be searching, to a quieter sector of service tunnels. The walls here were lined with pipes, hissing faintly, and the dim glow of emergency lights cast long shadows. As they reached a service elevator, its doors rusted and creaking, Zara paused, her psychic senses tingling. "Wait," she whispered, closing her eyes. She felt a cluster of hostile minds nearby, sharp, focused, and closing in. PsyCorp agents. "They're tracking us." Jax raised his blaster, scanning the tunnel. "How many?" "5," Zara said, her voice tense. "They're armed and moving fast." Ren cursed under his breath. "We can't fight them here. Too exposed." Lena, already at the elevator's control panel, worked frantically, her fingers flying over the keypad. "I'm overriding the lock. Hold them off for 30 seconds." The sound of boots echoed closer, and Zara's heart raced. She reached out with her mind, trying to slow the agents, but their thoughts were shielded, trained to resist psychic intrusion. "They're protected," she said, frustration creeping in. Jax took cover behind a pipe, motioning for Ren to do the same. "Zara, can you distract them?" She nodded, focusing despite the strain. She projected a false psychic signal, making it seem like the group was fleeing down a side tunnel. The agent's footsteps hesitated, then split off, buying them time. The elevator doors groaned open, and Lena shouted, "Go!" They piled in, the cramped space smelling of oil and metal. As the doors closed, a blaster shot grazed the frame, sparking. Zara leaned against the wall, her head throbbing from the psychic effort. The elevator hummed upward, carrying them to the council chamber's level. When the doors opened, they faced a wide hallway lined with sleek, silver panels and glowing holographic signs. Galactic Council guards stood at the chamber's massive doors, their armor reflecting the station's bright lights. Zara stepped to the center, her boots echoing on the polished floor. "Honored members of the Galactic Council," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm Zara Navari, a Zorathian psychic. I bring evidence of a threat to our galaxy's peace." The room buzzed with whispers. Jax stood beside her, his presence grounding. "PsyCorp has been experimenting on psychics," he said, "building the Concord Project, a device to control minds and enslave entire populations." Lena raised the datapad, its screen glowing. We have videos, technical plans, and statements from victims. It's all here. The council leader, a being with stone-like skin and deep-set eyes, raised a hand for silence. These are serious accusations. Present your evidence. Zara closed her eyes, drawing on her psychic strength. She projected memories into the council's minds. Images of PsyCorp's sterile labs, psychics with lifeless eyes, and the pulsing core of the Concord Project. The horror was palpable, and gasps echoed through the chamber as the truth hit home. When she finished, the room fell silent, then erupted in debate. A human representative, his face lined with age, stood. "This is unforgivable. PsyCorp must be stopped." A Vexian, scales glinting, countered PsyCorp has powerful allies. Dismantling them risks galactic stability. The leader's voice cut through. "We will vote. Who supports declaring PsyCorp an outlaw organization, seizing their assets, and prosecuting their leaders?" Hands rose, some hesitant, others firm. The count revealed a strong majority. "It is decided," the leader declared. "PsyCorp is outlawed, effective immediately." Cheers rang out, though some sections stayed quiet, likely PsyCorp sympathizers. Zara's shoulders sagged with relief. They'd won. As they left the chamber, Jax placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm. "You were incredible, Zara." She smiled, exhaustion mingling with pride. "We all were. But the fight's not over." Lena, bouncing with energy, said, "I'm ready for whatever's next." On the observation deck, they stood together, watching ships weave through the starry void. The station's hum felt like a heartbeat, alive with possibility. Zara looked at the psychics below, now free to live without fear, and felt a spark of hope. For them, for herself, for the galaxy. 6 months had passed since PsyCorp's fall, and Nexus Point pulsed with a vibrant energy. The station's markets overflowed with life, traders hawking glowing gems, robotic vendors whirring, and the air thick with scents of alien spices and roasted meats. Above it all was a sense of freedom, a lightness that had been absent under PsyCorp's shadow. Zara stood on the observation deck, her breath fogging the transparent dome as she watched young psychics train below. Under a Zorathian teacher's guidance, they practiced lifting objects with their minds, their laughter echoing. Once hunted, psychics now walked openly, their abilities celebrated as gifts. Jax joined her, leaning against the railing, his broad frame relaxed. The station's lights glinted in his eyes, softening his usual intensity. "It's something, isn't it?" he said. "Seeing them free like this." Zara nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "I never thought we'd get here. Not after everything." Their journey had transformed the galaxy. With PsyCorp dismantled, its leaders in custody, psychics were no longer prey. Zara and Jax had founded the Psychic Protection Agency, PPA, a coalition to safeguard psychics and foster trust among species. Offices had sprung up on Nexus Point and beyond, staffed by volunteers from every corner of the galaxy. Lena had become their star strategist. Her knack for hacking and her fierce loyalty made her indispensable. She strode up now, datapad in hand, her ponytail swinging. "Got a report from the Outer Rim," she said, her voice brisk. "A cult calling themselves the Shroud is targeting psychics. They're small but organized. Could be trouble." Jax raised an eyebrow, a spark of his old mercenary fire returning. "Sounds like we're back in business." Zara laughed, the sound light and free. "Good. I was starting to miss the action." Lena grinned, shaking her head. "You too are hopeless. Trouble follows you like a stray pet." As they walked to the PPA's office, a modest space crammed with consoles and star charts, Zara reflected on their path. She'd been a fugitive, broken, and hunted when Jax found her.